thank you everybody for coming today. My name is Michael Payan. I'm a co-founder of Sussex Health and Environmental Network. We do work on the Delmarva Peninsula, much of it around industrial agriculture, biogas, folks with contaminated air, contaminated water. So here to discuss CAFOs and biogas with you guys today. Our panelists, Patty Lavera, Dr. Deanne Williams, and Dr. Christini, and Maria Payan here. I'm going to give them the opportunity to introduce themselves because I don't think I could do them justice. And if you want to go through a quick round of intros here, each of you.
Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Patty Lavera, and I live right down the road in Washington, D.C. And I am a policy advisor, lobbyist, et cetera, type person for a coalition called the Campaign for Family Farms and the Environment. So we have some national groups and some state-based groups from the Midwest who are really kind of in the, have lived through the transition of how we raise animals from a system that used to be much more about independent, family scale operations that included animals, and they have lived through this unfortunate and not accidental transition to a factory farm system that we're going to talk about. So they all do work at their state level as well, but there's a lot of federal reasons that we have this system. So we together we do federal policy to work to try to undo some of the props that are propping that system up.
Great, thanks, Patty. My name is Deanne Williams. I'm a faculty member at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, and I'm in environmental health and engineering. I also am a focus area lead for industrial food animal production at the Center for a Livable Future.
Hi, everyone. My name is Chris Heaney. I'm also a faculty member at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health and Environmental Health and Engineering, and have worked in the areas of environmental epidemiology, occupational epidemiology, and community-driven research. And through an initiative that we're leading with the Center for a Livable Future called Community Science and Innovation for Environmental Justice, we're focusing on community-driven, community-lived experiences, recognizing that there's that there's basically, with an absence of just perhaps data, it's no less true what is happening. And so often we're just trying to provide those capacities that we're hearing a lot about from the ground up. So that's an initiative that we're getting off the ground.
Hi, I'm Maria Payan, Executive Director of Sussex Health and Environmental Network, and we work also on the lower eastern shore of Maryland. As you know, the peninsula is a lot of industrial animal production. And the work is Sentinels of Eastern Shore Health on the Lower Shore Group. And we work on basic, what I call human rights issues, environmental justice, public health, the right to a clean, healthy environment. And we're on the ground working with communities all the time. Whoops.
So we're going to let Patty come up here and give you guys a quick introduction, talking about the progression from the small farm to the biodigester facility.
Okay. Yeah. So I think if the slides are awake, I'll use them. If not, there we go. This is going to be really fast because we want to have a discussion and get more into the kind of like on-the-ground experiences. But just to start with just a couple minutes of kind of what we're talking about when we jump into our, jargon of CAFO and factory farm and industrial food animal production. So you will hear us say CAFO. It's a concentrated animal feeding operation. That is a legal term. There is a definition about when you become one, but more important than the numbers. So some of the numbers are over there on the left. When you hit 1,000 animal units, we have animal units so we can compare different animals to each other based on their poop. This entire conversation, this whole day is just about poop, so let's just get it out there. But we are way, way past a lot of these legal definitions about how many animals we're putting in one place most of the time in most of the examples that are going to come up. But there is a line where it crosses into being a CAFO, or what we for ease just call a factory farm. But one of the defining characteristics, in addition to the numbers, is that the animals are not outside for the reasons that they are outside on a smaller farm, right? They're not outside on pasture. If they're a grazing animal, it's much more about confinement. And you will actually hear a lot of people slip into saying that the C in CAFO is for confinement as much as concentration. And then this little example on the right is old. It stops at 2012 because I didn't have time to go get a new graphic. But the trend has continued. That's a snapshot from one place. And if you've done your intro to food studies reading, and you heard about Michael Pollan and, get big or get out, this is what get big or get out looks like on the ground. So if in the early 80s, you were talking about in the state of Iowa, which has always raised hogs, it was always been a logical place to raise that animal for all kinds of reasons. There was feed there was access to the market to slaughter those pigs there. There was always hog production in Iowa. But if you started in the 80s and you thought about it, there were almost 50,000 farms there that raised some hogs. But it wasn't the only thing that they did. They did other things, and hog production was part of a more diverse way to farm. We saw a lot of mergers during that time. We saw a complete failure to enforce key antitrust laws about how these marketplaces work, who they buy from, how they treat their buyers. And during that time, every 5 years when the USDA measures who is raising hogs in Iowa, the number of farms went down dramatically. By 2012, we were down below 10,000 farms that had any hogs on them. We didn't run out of bacon during that time. Iowa didn't get out of the hog business. What we saw is that there were fewer of those operations raising those animals, but the operations that did were much, much, much larger, and that's the green line that's jumping up. The average hog farm is way, 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 way bigger. And that doesn't matter just for the economics of like, oh, you don't get to be a hog farm anymore and you wanted to. It matters for the communities where those facilities are located because those farms are different. You are confining much larger numbers of animals in one spot, and that means you are concentrating their waste in that one spot. So this has had all kinds of, all right, let's see if I can work the machine. This has had all kinds of impacts. Again, this is a little bit old. There's another census out, but it didn't get any better. This has done things on two levels. So we've concentrated the number of animals in one physical spot on one farm. And we also concentrate the production in certain regions of the country. So this is for hogs. You can see where the hot spots are, and we will have a conversation about what kind of communities. You can take a wild guess if you're at this conference, what kind of communities end up being the hot spots. And I'm not gonna make you go through every animal type. There's a similar map. Maybe it's a different region of the country, but we are consolidating that production in a region of the country for each piece of the animal agriculture system, and sometimes, like in North Carolina, they overlap, where we do a ton of hogs and we also do a ton of chicken. So you're dealing with like that double whammy of what that impact is. This is what a CAFO can look like. This is not the only model, but this is a model from above. So those are animals filled with thousands of hogs in this case. The manure falls through the floor. It is so much manure that is not going to be handled mechanically the way it would be in the good old-fashioned family farm where you're like mucking out a barn. That's not happening. The manure is handled with water. So we are making contaminated water by moving all that manure in a liquid system so it can end up in a lagoon. These are older models when you have these big outdoor lagoons. Some other parts of the country, they do it a different way. But now you've got an enormous quantity of contaminated water with manure in it that you have to deal with. They can overflow. We've had hurricane problems. We've had just structural problems where they overflow, and because they get overfilled, there can be leaks. So there's a tremendous body of water impacts we can have from this model, but you still also have solid waste that has to be dealt with. And yet another difference between, kind of a family farm, the picture that's on the package, where there's 1,000 head of pigs over the course of a year integrated into a system where they can take that manure and use it as fertilizer in a rational way where it actually is getting used by crops. When the manure from this system is a waste, and it's about waste disposal, but we do it in the same way, which is applying it to farm fields and pretending that it's going to be taken up by those crops and that it's not going to be over-applied. So there's tremendous community impacts. We're going to talk about them. These are different facilities. I'm not going to run through this whole list. This just gives you a flavor of the types of things communities are dealing with. And so there's air issues if you are unfortunate enough to live next to this. There's water issues. There are broader public health implications for what drugs are being used in that facility. Do they make it into the animals, into the food supply that come out? We're now talking about flu and other diseases that may not stay put on these facilities. So they really are a different beast that we have to be thinking about differently if we're talking about health. And there's a tremendous impact on rural communities in terms of the fabric of what a farming community used to look like when you had If you had 100 farms, I always do this math wrong. If you had 100 farms raising 1,000 animals, that is different than 10 farms raising 10,000. And I probably got those zeros wrong, but you know what I'm saying, right? In terms of the economics of who's participating in that rural economy. Do you need the local lawyer, the local vet, the local feed dealer? What does the main street look like in a town where you have 3 operations doing everything that 30 operations used to do if we had that? So it just goes on and on. We have a new twist that, to kind of bring this home and let other people talk. So now we're having a conversation about what's happening in that lagoon. One of the things that's happening in that lagoon is if there's not oxygen in there, it's anaerobic. It is a great way to create methane. So we have this we're having this conversation about methane, the methane source of a lagoon full of manure that's breaking down. So, like with many environmental choices, there's a fork in the road. We could deal with that by maybe not having giant anaerobic lagoons full of manure to create methane, or we could monetize it. And so there's a lot of effort being spent to monetize that methane. So you can put a big old balloon over it. That's a member of Congress walking around on one because he thinks it's cute and he got them money in California. Some of them, they build a special vessel. There's different technologies, but it boils down to continuing to produce that amount of manure, capturing the methane to do something with it. We had a first generation of this technology where they were burning that methane in a generator right there in that spot for electricity. It's actually very hard to do that. The technology is real fussy. And so now we're at the second or third generation, depending on who you ask, where they're trying to take that methane, refine it into being the equivalent of fossil natural gas, and to put it into the energy system. That might be putting it into a pipeline or trucking it in some cases, which is a can of worms that communities should not have to deal with, thinking about trucks full of compressed natural gas leaving this facility, but it is happening. So this is a whole nother add-on injury to the original injury of having these CAFOs in communities. There is, this is just a picture of one thing that is happening, and we have somebody here thinking about pipelines. We're now seeing a lot of very, very large digester interest, where they will gather the manure from multiple very large CAFOs, sometimes through a pipeline, sometimes with trucks, to a central spot, which looks a lot more like an energy plant than anything that's agricultural, because they have access to a gas pipeline, that the gas they create there from the manure can then go into that pipeline, often to be paid a subsidy from the state of California. So there's a layer cake effect of subsidies and incentives, none of which move in the right direction of saying, why is that original community with the CAFO burdened with that? It's all piling on extra stuff and extra impacts, and worst case scenario, just an enormous waste of money that this doesn't actually fix our energy problems, and we didn't make any progress towards investing in something besides the CAFO system. So that was very fast, but we just wanted to start there about kind of what we're dealing with. This isn't the picture you're going to see on the Chevron ad, where they talk about cow power and how we're going to run buses for the win-win-win of the new generation of sustainable energy from this unavoidable stuff we have that comes out of the cute little family farm with 3 cows. That is not what we're talking about. This is. So we just want to start there so then we can have this conversation about what communities are dealing with and how they're fighting back, most importantly. So let me stop there.
Thank you for that overview,
You don't
Pat.
have to keep staring at the horrible picture. We don't want it.
Okay, great. Thank you for that overview. So we'll get right into the questions here. The first one's for Dr. Heaney. How has community-driven science been instrumental in identifying and addressing the public health impacts of CAFOs and biogas facilities in Maryland, Delaware?
Sure. Thanks for that, Michael. And I do want to make sure, I don't know if all the panelists feel this way, just to make it a conversation. I didn't prepare slides just to help facilitate that. So if anybody has any thoughts, please jump in, build on it, share your own experiences. So one way I'll start this is that really, this is a new technology, right? CAFO, the legacy issues that Patty just laid out, the legacy CAFO, it's been well documented for decades, the environmental injustice, the structural environmental racism of this, okay? And so just like any other new technology, take the pharmaceutical industry, new drug, new treatment, is it efficacious? Is it going to help in some way? What have the fields all known the way that you need to approach this. It's the, okay, who's funding the work behind something that's new that's saying it's going to be better or address something, right, or address historic environmental injustices. And so I think one thing is that you have all of these lived experiences from communities all across the country that are seeing what it's like to live next to these large-scale CAFO biodigesters. But in one way of answering the what do we know about this new technology, and the public claims that they're clean, that they're green, that they're safe, that they're economically beneficial, their answers to that are, in my opinion, from my background, they're confounded or they're biased by this really basic principle to say what disciplines are contributing to the information in that space. Are they coming from agricultural schools? Who's funding them? Are they coming from partnerships with economic departments or schools? Who's funding them? There are really clear examples of Duke Energy teaming up with Google, teaming up with the Duke Endowment to fund a bunch of environmental and civil engineering studies, right, of the what are there climate benefits? Are there carbon offsets? Are there economic benefits to these, right? And I think from that community science perspective, whose voices are not represented there? Whose experiences are not represented in the current way that we have to answer this question of what are the possible benefits, if they are, and for whom? So that's a key question that we try to think about, and Marie and Michael, Devon Hall, and the Rural Empowerment Association for Community Help in North Carolina, the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network is focusing on these issues. In different parts of North Carolina, Southern Environmental Law Center is really digging into this, because when you start to look, and if you make measurements, all you need when there's literally no evidence, right? Don't confuse the absence of evidence of harm with evidence that there is no harm, right? All you need is an N of one example, right? One community that's speaking out says, I think this is creating a big problem with air pollution. Just say that, water, soil, you can separate that out. All you need to do is make measurements and confirm that there are hotspots of hydrogen sulfide, methane, ammonia, perhaps CO2 as well, next to the infrastructure for these livestock, CAFO, anaerobic digester technologies. It could be like we've done in North Carolina with Devon Hall, the Optima KV facility, which is this brand new pilot scale. None of the neighbors, none of the community members knew why the trees were being cleared, why there was a concrete pad being put down, why there were tanks being put up, why there were generators. And then one day there was a noise that they heard of tanks off-gassing and then massive malodor plumes, right? Which we happened to be doing mobile air monitoring, driving around, and caught it. And it was one of the largest spikes that we've ever observed of hydrogen sulfide, of methane, at ambient levels where people live, where they work, where they play. So I think one of the challenges and one of the opportunities is with the technology that if you just look at the records, and our lawyers have been incredibly helpful with Public Information Act requests, the non-processed, unconditioned swine CAFO biogas, the levels of hydrogen sulfide are so astoundingly high that they are immediately dangerous to health and life. Workers would not be able to physically remove themselves if they were subject to an acute release at one of these facilities. And there have been documented reports of workers dying as a result of having to repair tanks, going inside enclosed spaces where they can't escape. This had been instances where previous community partners who had shared experiences like this, it was on an animal rendering facility where a tank underneath the animal rendering protein processing needed to be fixed. The worker would go inside, and then they would experience acute hydrogen sulfide toxicity and be literally disabled for the rest of their lives because of this. And now we've got infrastructure that's going to pop up at scale across rural America that's going to be with that unconditioned gas by truck, by pipeline, by local individual swine CAFOs. The estimates are 4,000 parts per million hydrogen sulfide by some of the records. Immediately dangerous to health and life NIOSH levels are 200 to 700 parts per million. So conditioning of this gas, the requirements are to bring it back down, to be clean, to have a certain methane concentration to meet up with the regional pipelines. it would be 4 parts per million. 4 parts per million hydrogen sulfide is the level of cleaning of hydrogen sulfide. All of the previous epidemiologic studies done by Steve Wing and the groups in Iowa have shown, that's 4,000 parts per billion, have shown really massive adverse health effects with respiratory conditions, with mucous membrane irritation, with adverse impacts on ability to enjoy your home, your environment, at 20 to 200 parts per billion of hydrogen sulfide. And it's because hydrogen sulfide is a gas you can measure, but it's representative of a more complex mixture of malodorant compounds in that material that comes from swine CAFOs. So I think the community science aspect is people's noses were not wrong when the original, I'm going to say legacy CAFO infrastructure was coming out and trying to defend against the nuisance, the health, the adverse impacts on life. And what we're learning initially is that people's noses are not wrong now. And they're raising alarm bells. They're saying they believe it's much more acute, it's much more powerful, and it's much more concerning to them. The other part of this in community science that needs to be investigated, and our preliminary data are pretty concerning, is that in rural America, in places like North Carolina and Delmarva that we all know are affected by catastrophic flooding from seasonal storms and expansions of the season for storms, I don't think many people worried that a disaster of that nature would create an explosion, a catastrophic explosion, as often perhaps regulatory decisions are being made about the placement of classic fossil fuels infrastructure, right? There's a lot of concerns and well-recognized awareness about this in the Deep South in Louisiana. But a lot of the places where fossil fuels infrastructure is, it's about, projecting what would happen if sea level rise were to occur, like California. Rachel Morello-Frosch has done a really amazing analysis of this. But we're talking, and it is happening, that this fossil fuels intensive infrastructure is being built in places we already know flood routinely, okay? So that's another thing that we're hearing from community partners, and we're trying to think about the initial measurements that we could make that could, when you go back to that, why does the evidence base look like it is, when Congress is saying, hey, this is being told this is a green, clean, triple win, right? Why is the evidence that way? And you don't have to look that far back. Pharmaceutical industries, tobacco, lead, it's a very similar pattern.
This one's from Maria. If you could talk about within the industrial ag system, the related infrastructure, processing plants, biogas facilities, what does that look like for communities on the ground? What does that look like for workers that are handling those processes every day?
So, yeah, I'm glad you asked this question, because if folks have not lived in an area where they have industrial animal production, factory farms, CAFOs, it's quite an awakening. I myself grew up in a rural area, a suburb in Pennsylvania. When we had moved to Baltimore, when Michael was born, I wanted him to grow up in the same type of a rural area, not Baltimore City, where he didn't have a yard. So we went and bought a house, and we had a business right across the street from a farm. And it was perfect. It was, what every mother wants their child, I would assume. I mean, I wanted it to be able to go into the woods. There was woods next to it. There was, behind our property, there was a pond with a horse, and he could feed carrots through the fence. I mean, there was cows on pasture next door. It was a great childhood until they sold the farm. And when they sold the farm, agribusiness came in. And what happened was, all of a sudden we had one house being put up, two houses being put up, three, and I'm talking poultry houses, not houses, okay? 4 poultry houses put up. Then a cattle feedlot went up on the same property with liquid underground manure storage, where they bring in the cattle at the end of the cycle to basically fat them up before slaughter. And then after that, about a quarter to a half mile as a crow flies, they wanted to bring 5,000 hogs in. And no children in the room, excuse my language here, but how much shit can you put within a half mile? Okay? Now, we lived across the street, downhill. All the runoff from the farms went through a little trail underneath the road into the pond that was in the back, near my well, because when you live in a rural area, you're on well water. As I mentioned, I was a business owner, a mother, you know, just raising my family. Then we had a mass mortality across the street. And this is what you don't hear when we talk about the pictures of all this waste. When something goes wrong on an industrial farm, it's not like if something goes wrong on the kind of farms that, you know, we grew up reading about in books. It is very problematic. So we had a mass mortality across the street in the middle of summer. 20,000 birds died. No one told any of the neighbors anything. Although the entire neighborhood knew something was going terribly wrong, because if you can imagine 20,000 birds rotting in the sun, okay, right? We had animals that had hot spots and bacterial infections. People all across were talking about it. No news reports, because it's the rural code. You don't speak against your neighbor. They're job providers, okay? So you sit there and you say, what's going wrong? Well, when I was pulling him out of the bathtub with palm-sized blisters all over his body, that's what set me in for a redirection of my life's work, because someone had to do something to make people aware, because it was an injustice that was going on to the families that lived near this. And I was certain that once all the facts came out, it would stop and things would change. Last year, I came to the realization that I no longer believe that. I don't, you know, and that's really sad to say, because I was sure that that's what provided this direction. But this is what goes on, okay? People don't have water. I've worked in communities where there is multiple birth defects, next door neighbors having miscarriages, children that can't be educated because they have developmental disabilities. That is a crime that is inexcusable to me, because they can't have clean water coming out of their tap. Are you kidding me? And I don't have to tell you where and who are the neighbors to facilities. Like Chris said, look where we are. The workers, we've talked to doctors, okay, who they're 70% of their clients are poultry workers there. And you hear stories of workers that are working very hard. English is a second language. They are not being trained in their native language. Went to work, lost a limb before they got their first paycheck. Yeah, I'm going to say it. This is what's going on. Multiple people, story after story after story, have to have doctors send in a letter to the integrator to allow them to go to the bathroom. Now the solution is biogas. Again, now the communities that are working and closest to the facility, where we have a Title VI filed an administrative complaint. First closest community, English as a second language, Latino. Second closest community, English as a second language, Haitian. They work at the plants, they're exposed there all day to pollution, and they live near it, and they come home, and now they're really exposed all the time. So we need to think of a system, and I wish I could say I believe we could get back to that system where local rural communities thrived. the money stayed in communities, right? It was a place where a family could be raised and enjoy the open spaces and the beauty of, and it's, I'm not sure that that's ever going to be possible, and that's really sad. It's really sad.
Dr. Williams, how do you see CAFOs and biogas facilities exacerbate existing inequalities in rural communities, particularly as it relates to race, socioeconomic status?
So I'm going to start my comments by saying the opinions that I'm going to say are mine. They don't represent the Center for a Livable Future or Johns Hopkins University. So anyway, so the theme of the conference here is past, present, future. And, you know, I started thinking about a lot of the reasons why I got involved in this work. And one of the things that I thought was very interesting, and Chris spoke about some of the hazards associated with potential flooding and things like that. And because of the flooding in North Carolina with Hurricane Florence in the late 90s, the USDA and the EPA came to a decision, and they signed a memorandum of understanding between the two of them that the USDA would work primarily on, you know, regulating the industries or regulating the farms, but that the EPA would be responsible for any kind of public health information or public health investigation. And in my opinion, the EPA has really not kind of held up that bargain, that end of the bargain. And I think that, you know, as Chris said, you know, the absence of evidence does not mean that there's no problem. And I think that, you know, it's very clear what the implications, the public health implications are of a lot of the industrial animal production facilities. You know, we have contaminated water, contaminated air, contaminated soil, and especially when you look at the soil and the water, these are finite resources that we really need to pay attention to. And we need to make sure that those resources are available for future generations and for the communities that are living in those areas. Another thing, too, is that air emissions are not actually regulated around CAFOs, around agricultural facilities, because of the memorandum of understanding that was agreed upon between the USDA and the EPA. The one thing that I did want to say, too, is that in some areas they are trying to regulate some of the air emissions that are associated with very egregious operators and egregious situations. But at the same time, there's no monitoring in rural areas where we can actually understand what these communities are being exposed to. If you look at the EJ screen databases, agriculture is not included in any of those databases. So when you think about the federal, like Patty talked about, the federal response to this need, it's been pretty much lackluster, and that's my opinion. But I feel like we need to do a better job. And I'm really heartened by the tic-tacs and the match and the magic because of the fact that when you look at urban communities who do the consumption of these meat products and the rural communities that are suffering because of our reliance on eating meat or our desire to eat meat, there's no connection there. And so, you know, when you look at the tic-tacs and a lot of the traditional EJ stuff, you're looking at, you know, refineries, ports, to, you know, transportation, those kind of things. And I'm hoping that those tic tacs and those things that have been created by the EPA will help to bridge those communities to understand that we need the support from each other to address EJ issues as a whole. And I think I'll leave it at that.
Next one's for Patty here. How has the influence of industrial ag lobby impacted policy decisions related to CAFOs and biogas facilities, particularly as it relates to subsidies, and what can be done to counteract that influence?
Okay, so that's like a 3-day question. I'm going to take a deep breath, and I'm not going to cuss too much, but I'm going to cuss a little bit. So we have this system, not because it is efficient for anybody except the very large companies that are processing those animals. It is not the best system by anybody's measure except those companies. We have this system because of political power. And who has it, and it is those companies. So I think I mentioned, really quickly in passing on that graph about like the number of farms raising animals went down, but the number of animals in the state went up. There's a lot of policy behind that shift that allowed that to happen. So, I'm not going to do the farm bill. We don't have enough time to do the whole farm bill, but our farm bill is so steered by big, powerful interests who designed this system. That includes the meat packers and chicken companies themselves. It also, they are in incredibly tight alliance with the companies that process the corn and the soybeans that are the feed for those animals. So we are no longer at a system where the animals are integrated into a farm where their poop is fertilizer to grow some crops that they can eat. That is not happening at the scale that we are doing it. So there's an enormous corn and soy industrial complex that is very incredibly tightly linked with this meat and poultry industrial complex, and they write the farm bill together. So there's a ton of money that comes from that. There's a ton of if you are getting official advice from the federal government about how to be a modern farmer, it tells you to do that, right? Everything else, pasture-based, everything else is scraps, tiny little crumbs at the table of what official agriculture, which is usually paid for with taxpayer dollars at land-grant universities such as University of Maryland. The official science is to get bigger and to do it this way. And if there's a problem, we'll find a new product that agribusiness will sell you to solve that problem, like a antibiotic or something. So there's a ton of policy, there's a ton of money that comes from that about why we have them. Then there's the EPA and the environmental rules that agriculture is powerful enough to basically get out of. I mean, you name it, if there is an environmental rule, agriculture has done a damn good job probably of getting themselves exempt. And that is at the local level, state level, federal level. So we're 3 decades into fighting in court about how and sometimes if the Clean Water Act applies to this system. Right? I mean, that's what it boils down to. Lawyers are keeling over right now as I say that. But from the outside as non-lawyer, that's what it looks like. And the permitting is ineffective, and we don't even have a map. Yeah, so I mean, it goes on and on and on, but the policy is being written by these large companies, which is why the system looks the way it does, because they have a tremendous amount of political power, because they have a tremendous amount of money.
Yeah, and I think another really good example to be aware of and to really study what's happening and how to build community coalitions to push back is in North Carolina. Okay, they passed statewide legislation when the Smithfield nuisance lawsuits were being so successful at representing faithfully the environmental injustices of the neighbors of the large swine CAFOs. The General Assembly passed laws that said no individual in North Carolina is allowed to sue for nuisance grounds against this agricultural industry. So community coalitions have been very powerful in North Carolina at securing a statewide moratorium on permits, no more permits for any lagoons or spray fields for swine CAFOs, right? As a part of that deal, study this very carefully, it was a part of a coalition that fractured, and they allowed that statewide moratorium to go forward with the little caveat that they would be eligible, that swine CAFOs would be eligible to be put into the state's renewable energy portfolio, okay? Which is where we are now. And so that happened at a time no one knew the Smithfield lawsuits were going to have the effect they did with the legislature changing the law. But we've come to learn now from our legal experts that even though public marketing claims are being made, you've heard it all over, farms, CAFOs are energy producers now. How is the fossil fuel and energy industry regulated? But in North Carolina right now, we've heard from our legal experts that there's no way that they see to bring an argument that these farms, although they're claiming and acting like energy producers, could be regulated with the environmental and public health expectations of protection of neighbors like a fossil fuel industry energy producer would be. So they're having their cake and eating it too. And we need to start organizing coalitions to start calling this out and take what's going on in North Carolina and say, how can we learn from this? How can we put pressure to say it can't be both ways? You can't be a large scale promising a climate solution with a fossil fuel that's basically methane that also has a nuisance because you can't purify it enough to reduce the hazardous malodorous concerns and not be regulated as somebody who's contributing methane to offset carbon emissions. So,
Hey, I just have one other thing to say about that is, number one, the system itself is not standardized. There are many different types of feedstock that go into it. There's manure, there's animal mortalities, there's food waste, there's agricultural waste. There's all kinds of things that go into these systems. There's no regulation on what can go into the systems. There are no regulations on any of the standards associated with emissions associated with them. There's no worker protections associated with them. And think about the fact that there are no community protections either. There's no protection of the fence line communities. And one other thing that I wanted to say, and this is kind of out of sync, but one of the other things that happened this year that I was very disturbed about was in West Virginia, they actually introduced a bill to prevent any kind of citizen science from being used for any kind of tort or nuisance suit, as well as any kind of regulatory decisions by the state. So it didn't pass, but at the same time, I brought that to the attention of the legal table at one of the coalitions that we're part of, to let them know that this is the next step of what they're going to try to do.
Let me add one number to this subsidy conversation. I just realized we haven't said numbers, and we all know how outrageous it is, but now you can be outraged too. So one digester, the cheapest digester project I've seen was $500,000. And that is what you would put on one confinement lagoon, right? And so in places like North Carolina, Smithfield is saying, we're going to spend this money at each one of them, and there may be hundreds. Then you have to get the gas somewhere, maybe through a pipeline, which is tremendous amounts of money per mile. And it is literally a PowerPoint the industry does to show these companies, like the people trying to do it in a specific place, all the different places they can get government money. So you can get money from the federal farm bill from 2 different spots in the same programs where small family farms get turned away because they run out of money, but they can get $450,000 for one digester project. We have renewable energy grants. There's a bunch of digesters on big dairies in California that every time there's a round of grants from this renewable energy program at USDA, there's a long list of digesters that got $1 million a shot for 20 or 30 of them. Then there's often state, like North Carolina has a state subsidy. California will pay, part of its low carbon fuel standard, they will pay for gas generated anywhere in the country. So digesters are being built all over the country to tap into California's renewable gas portfolio. There are private carbon markets, so companies are buying credits and bragging about it. It goes on and on and on. And the last thing I'll say is, so I work with a group in Minnesota, and they're seeing a ton of these digesters pop up on very large dairies. And the companies don't stop at that level of subsidy. They're going to local counties and saying, you need to build us roads. You need to improve your infrastructure to the tune of tens of millions of dollars. And this group does a ton of beautiful sustainable agriculture work, literally building markets for small farms to serve local markets. And they're like, if you got $20 million laying around, this is what we could do with it. But instead, they're going to float bonds to build a road for, in this case, Shell Energy to build a digester to move manure and gas around. Like it's literally, and then and that's one of the projects where they were going to move the gas by truck on state roads. What could go wrong? But it's on the town to have the emergency response plan for that. I mean, it just keeps getting more offensive, and they're not paying for it themselves. So it really is a boondoggle, and it's the sheer amounts of money are why we're like this. Like it's extra insulting on top of like the original problem that communities are dealing with.
So a couple things came to mind. One is talking about the money and the subsidies and the outrageousness to communities, science, things like that. So in Pennsylvania, there's something called, and every state that is an ag state, there are right to farm laws. I suggest everyone to take a look at them and see that literally our justice system, we are usurping. When you cannot take a claim against some operation that wrongs you because they're too powerful, like that's beyond it. It's just beyond. The system that we're talking about with the biogas that I mentioned with the civil rights complaint, the way this was represented to the community was that this was going to take the litter from the farmers, right, which has been a problem with water quality and running off, the dry broiler litter, and help the farmers. This was put in an ag residential zone, which our zoning mandates that it should be in heavy industrial zone. But that went through because that's just the Delaware way. We tried to have the citizens tried to have another zoning hearing, wouldn't happen. When we started looking at all the details in it, and Food and Water Watch was helping with some of that, it didn't make sense economically. Like, you would use millions of gallons of water and there would be no economic benefit, so why would someone do it? Well, when it actually came time and they got it through local zoning and the rubber hits the road when you have to go for the state permits, all of a sudden we find out, oh, it's not just broiler litter coming. 88% of the project is going to be processing plant waste from 4 different states. DAF, okay, dissolved air pollution. I'm not going to get in the technical jargon, but let's just say 4 different states: Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. And we're going to bring it to this one small area next to 2 communities with English as a second language in a residential ag zone. And we're going to put flares and we're going to burn it and extract methane. And then there's going to be digestate that is a byproduct, which, well, if we're bringing in 250,000 tons of waste from 4 states, okay, that digestate, that's the byproduct, where is that going to go? 73,000 tankers a year on streets that are designed one direction, one lane each side.
Maria, would you speak about, was city sewage sludge mentioned?
Well, not there, but interestingly, Maryland was going to get a gasification plant, but then when we went and did PIA requests, the community was concerned there, and they were going to add sewage into it as well. And once they heard that, that kind of shut that project down. But yeah, this is, we really need to think. It was funny, in Pennsylvania, we had CAFOs, and we had Ron Gola, Terry Greenwood, probably all these names are friends. Some of them are no longer with us. But there, we were educating about, you had the gas going on with no public health studies, before it happened, just like this. And the natural gas, I mean, it was just a nightmare. I've seen things that I never thought I would see in this country. But it was funny because the CAFO people would send me the natural gas, the fracking articles, and the fracking people would send me the CAFO articles from here, because you know what? It didn't matter if it was Range Resources or if it was, Tyson or anybody else. It was the same game.
Yeah, and getting back to the digestate, I mean, it's even though you have this energy producing facility, you still have tons of digestate, which is basically somewhat processed manure, and then that also gets applied to fields, and gets applied to to soil and things like that. And there are like pharmaceuticals that are in that. There are bacteria. There's other chemicals. There's cleaning chemicals associated with those things. And then when you talk about sewage sludge, we all know about the PFAS problem. You end up distributing that all over a lot of different, like a vast area to get rid of that digestate. And we know from research that sometimes those things, the bacteria is not inactivated. Sometimes the chemicals are not inactivated. So those, the application of that to the land can also have, like cascading consequences.
Yeah, and yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it depends. And actually, a lot of the liquid off the digestate is applied in a spray field. And then there's a solid that's actually left over in the bottom that gets then applied as a solid to a field.
So actually, as an organizing point in a room like this, if you all are living in a community that's hearing about digesters, we've been talking to more folks in different parts of the country. Some places where people are having some luck blocking digester proposals, this is actually the point, if they're early enough in the process. So some places, like I showed a picture of that huge one, and it's like the draw area for that might be pretty big, like really big dairies in a big radius are sending the waste to that digester. They don't want to ship the digestate back that far. They don't want to burn the gas to like take it back. So they try to line up contracts for farms to take the digestate as fertilizer. A lot of them don't want it because it might be food waste one day, it might be sewage sludge one day. It might not be very good fertilizer coming out if you're a farmer trying to understand the chemistry of that. And it's too much, usually, for the number of contracts they have. And that has been a breaking point in some fights, not all, but where people are getting into that piece of the business model of the digester, because it's not magic. It doesn't make it disappear. They're taking the part they find value in, the gas, and they still got to deal with the liquid and the solid waste. And of course, they're going to try to deal with it in the cheapest way, which is going to be a burden on the community they put it on. So that's a real point for people who are, especially early in a fight, to focus on, I think.
Just want to give each of you the opportunity to respond to this real quick before we open up for questions from the folks that are here. We do only have, I think, less than 15 minutes, so just getting towards the end, wrapping it up. Talked about a lot of problems today. From each of your perspectives, whether it be community organizing, science, policy, how do we get to the solutions that we need to start moving in the right direction? And then we'll open up for some questions.
Data. We need data. Okay? We need data. We don't need data funded by the industry that they're going to come back and say, oh, no, we have to do 5 more years of data. We need data. We have the equipment right now where we can get data, and this needs to be happening everywhere. People believe in science. We now have the equipment 20 years ago we didn't have. Let's get the data, and let's make change. You can see I like citizen science.
Wow, Maria, I'd give you the $20 later. No, but so I'm gonna, and that's odd that I'm gonna flip it, because I also think we need to think about some of the organizing areas, because data, the lack of data is exploited. I mean, the absence of evidence of harm, the absence of data about harm gives a runway for a product to be basically promulgated. And then often you're catching up with lawsuits. I mean, it doesn't matter what it is. I mean, if there's evidence of harm that comes out later, a lot of the litigation can catch up and try to recoup it. But I think here it would be organizing around some things and sharing information. Maria, we were invited in to learn about some developments in Alberta, Canada. Just taking a look around, not just neighbors, North America, where you might say it's about question the feasibility of this, but apparently there's a nationwide effort there to try to have an honest, serious discussion of legislation that would be anti-greenwashing. And the prospect of that moving forward and becoming law has apparently led to a lot of the if you click on biogas and CAFOs anywhere, you have tons of websites that pop up with really crisp, beautiful pictures. How many trees are you going to offset? How many cars are you going to offset? Apparently, the reporters there are seeing that a lot of the companies have taken down those public-facing websites and claims for concern about consequences of potentially anti-greenwashing legislation that can have teeth. So that would be an interesting organizing area. I recognize that it requires maybe science or data, but I would actually argue that many of our coalition members are seeing the data. Lawyers are getting access to the mandated reporting that these infrastructure projects are having to declare, having to answer what are the levels of these gases, these toxic hazardous gases, in addition to the methane, which is the product of interest, right? And so I think building off of that, we could potentially organize and do something we've got an economic engine saying at this scale, with this conditions, under now contracts are being around, it can be profitable. But there's a whole other area of economics, which is being hopefully they're saying, hope they never discover or think about it, but it's valuation economics and the full costs, and it's the externalities. And there's robust academic departments and disciplines. I've teamed up with an academic economist at Hopkins who's moved to UVA to do an external valuation of the impacts of antimicrobial resistance that can be attributed to CAFOs, right? That could be done. Those studies could be out there on biogas. What is missing from the answer that it turns a profit at this level if you do it this way? So I think if we need data, which may take a while from boots on the ground measurements, but there's a lot of existing information out there that lawyers have or parts of our coalition have that if we put them in the hands of economists to say just benefits at the fence line or for workers, what are the costs of a death? How many deaths could we reasonably put into estimates? Put bounds around it and say between none to 10 in a certain state or region of workers experiencing what's the cost of that? So I think that would be a clever, quicker way to get some different information into the space, which right now just seems like a triple bottom line win.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, I'm going to go with the public health part. We need to engage health clinicians. We need to engage more people who are actually measuring the effects in small communities and things like that. So I agree. More data. The data that I have looked at on biogas is, you have people doing small reactors in a lab somewhere, or I think the biggest one was a 200 head cattle dairy farm where they had done some research. And so we are not looking at any data from these very, very large facilities. So, okay, data and healthcare, more healthcare information.
All of that, we need all those things. I will say there are folks, we've been like super cheery in this session, right, about how big a fight this is, but there are folks in this fight. So there's people fighting at the local level. We're seeing these terrible state bills because people are winning at the local level, right? This is how our life works. Like you make a little progress and they try to cut you off at the next pass, right? So we just need to keep doing that. We need to link these local groups up with groups that have the capacity to work at the state level. And there's we've suffered a lot, I think, in this issue. There's always like, oh, that's rural communities. Oh, that's ag. That's different. So like for folks who are at this event who are thinking in environmental spaces, we have a lot of potential there, I think, for folks in the climate justice movement to see this piece Just because it's showing up in rural communities doesn't mean it's not a misfire, on what we should be doing on climate. So I think there's a ton of potential there to build on. There is good work happening. People are fighting like hell in their communities and at the state level especially. So I think if we can link up to other movements, we're going to do what we need to do.
Chris has got one more.
One more quick thing about that. When you're boxed in at the local level or the state level, these are private corporations, and in North Carolina, it took a lot of creative, strategic thinking about how you could file and structure a Title VI against a private company. But they eventually did it by going to the state permitting agency, Division of Water Quality, which issued the permits, gets a ton of federal funding, right? But here, with what you're saying, Patty, there's so much federal funding flowing into these companies now. I actually think Title VI would be a really clever, broad thing. If you train fence line communities to do this and file Title VI, Omega Wilson, y'all, he blocked multi-million, billion-dollar industrial complex projects because of a little tiny Title VI complaint that would not quit. That engine that he just kept alive, kept it active, fed every new piece of data in to keep it alive. I actually think that could be a really clever strategy. And I know we have people in the room.
Right? Because they are. Yeah.
Question?
Yeah. Do we need to repeat them?
Go for it.
Hi, folks. I'll try to project.
You can come up here.
Yeah, why don't you speak right into the mic?
So, thank you very much. Thank you all very much, and especially for sharing your personal stories. Maria, I'd like to ask you a little bit more about something you said earlier on about the rural code and not speaking ill of your neighbors because they're job providers. For folks who are looking to organize, connect with, bring tools to rural communities to help them fight the fight, what advice do you or any of the panelists have about specifically working in rural communities that have their own issues of sometimes disconnected infrastructure and other challenges?
So that's a great question. And I will say, okay, the rural code, what that is like, let me put it this way. Your neighbors in a rural area, everybody knows their neighbors. You go to the same grocery store, you go to the same churches, you go to the same schools. So it's very hard for people to publicly, come out or sign a petition. They're job providers, right? Our state mentions all the time that they provide so many jobs. Guess who's exempt from Delaware's labor code? I couldn't believe it. Agriculture and domestic workers. Isn't that interesting? Greatest job providers, but they're exempt from the labor code. That's the power that they have. That's the power that they have with lawmakers. That's the power that they have with big lobby groups. They tell them, oh, you're trying to put them out of business. No, we're trying to get them to be good neighbors. That's what we're trying to do. But with that, like, people won't sign petitions because they're scared. Their daughter works for the county. She might lose her job. This is what you're shaking your head because you work in the rural areas too. You know it. That's the rural code. So what do we need? Here's what we need. We need the rest of the population, what Chris was talking about, urban and rural, to jump on board and help. We have to get to the point where people living in cities or not urban areas, I think, have a responsibility now that they know to try to help to change a better system, right? Kids, when you ask kids where their groceries come, where, milk or, they think it's from the store. Like, we've lost that connectivity, I think, with the digital to growing food in your own backyard. So that's a great question, but you need the personal stories of the people there, and there's a couple that are brave enough to do it. I was one of them, like we were just talking about it last night. Windows put out, tried to get run off the road.
Oh, yeah.
Very serious. Because, so you need support, but there's people that are willing to do it because you have to. If you care about your community and you're invested, you have to. So. Long answer. One more.
I just want to say this was fantastic. So much really good information, and also
Time for one more. Go ahead.
I was just wanted to say that it's just in the morning engagement, they were talking about power to the people and how important it is to vote. And I always tell people in their local politics, you gotta pay attention.
Yep.
Who cares for your community so you can fire them. Because just like what you said in North Carolina, because they were starting to get traction with their lawsuits, guess what the legislator did?
Yep.
Prevent them from getting awarded that money. So, and they have powerful people working with them, attorneys, and so, but if we want to keep our democracy, our republic, it's up to us to put people in office that's going to support us.
That's for all of our issues.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I want Chris to share something that he shared with us, because I think it's important for the room to hear this.
Well, yeah, and kind of thinking about what you were saying and broadening the coalition, I think CAFO Biogas, and that's the title of the session, but I think it's important not to think of it narrowly in that way. And I think actually some of the partners that we work with, Maria Michael and South Baltimore Community Land Trust, are really making the connections with this. And if you look at the kind of what's happening in Baltimore, because the same companies that are pushing the permits down in Delmarva, it's the large transnational, I think the names are slightly different, but like Bioenergy Devco is an example of these. They're also having conversations with huge municipalities to put anaerobic digesters into cities to address and be this new climate solution for a different source of organics. But it is a model that's pushing out the opportunity for neighborhood-based community land trusts, for local agriculture, to be able to be distributing a very robust, useful product like black gold, like compost, like Marvin Hayes talks about with the Compost Collective. And it's just, I think there's a way for communities to build the coalition, to vote out, right, to use the ballot box power. And we're trying to see ways to connect the science to say, how does the fence line air quality look next to a large municipal urban anaerobic digester or an urban wastewater treatment plant compared to, we're not talking about the Blue Lagoon with these lagoons. These are cesspits, which would not be allowed in cities, right, of that size.
Yep.
So I think we already see the signals are way higher, but to kind of get the science to connect those communities in those spaces could also broaden the coalition. Maria, I think you wanted me to mention something that was really powerful in the nuisance lawsuits, which was about forensic technologies to answer whether or not people are right or wrong with the waste from swine affecting their homes. And so we've been able to bring some of this like DNA of bacteria that only live in the guts of pigs and their poop. And where does it end up by doing, like when you go to the airport, have you ever gotten like one of those Q-tip swabs, look for explosives or maybe illicit drugs? Well, you can do Q-tip swabs and find the DNA of the pig poop. And we found it on the tops of people's fridges where they store the bread and the cereal for their kids, the backs of the easy chair where they like to sit and relax, the top of the TV, the top of the ceiling fan, you know, your air conditioning unit. So this is something that is, again, under the quieting, the success but the quieting that's happened as a result of the settlement agreements from the nuisance lawsuits. We need communities to be working together and to get this information, these techniques, and these tools out there to try to help change things.
Yeah, that kind of puts it in perspective when your home has waste on the back of your easy chair where you're, you know, enough. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
We could take this all day, isn't it?
I know.
I know.